Good evening, and thanks again for joining me. Tonight's message I've entitled, The Potential to Lead. What does it take to be a good leader? Leadership is much more than just a position. In the Bible, we read about a variety of kings who come to power, a position of kingship. There's two books in the Bible entitled Kings. Leadership is important. We should learn from leaders, learn what to do and what not to do, because making decisions and taking responsibility is important. And both of those go hand in hand with leadership, making decisions and taking responsibility. John Maxwell, a prominent speaker and writer on leadership, wrote that after more than 5 decades of observing leadership within his family and many years developing his own leadership potential, that he came to the conclusion that leadership is influence. Leadership is influence. So the question for us as people who should want to make an impact and influence society, being the salt of the earth and the light of the world that we're called to be, the question for us should be twofold. That is, what is our influence? What is our influence? Who are we influenced by? And the second question is, who are we influencing? What is in our sphere of influence, and who is in our sphere of influence? What shapes us and makes us into the people we are becoming? For we as people are full of potential. Full of potential. Look around you. Everything is changing. Potential is having or showing the capacity to become or develop into something in the future. It is latent qualities or abilities that may be developed and lead to the future success and usefulness. Potential, to sum it up, potential is what we can be, what we can become. But just with the potential to become better, it can also go the other way, to become worse, or even stay the same, become stagnant. And so we see this contrast in the book of 2 Kings. Like I said, there's 2 books in the Bible entitled Kings, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. We read in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 1, in the 17th year of Pekah, son of Remaliah. Pekah, if we back up a couple verses, we see is king of Israel. And while he is the king of Israel, we see that the land has been divided, that there are 2 kingdoms. The land is divided into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel, ruled at this time by King Pekah, and the southern kingdom of Judah, ruled by Ahaz, son of Jonathan. The Bible gives us this list, a chronology of kings, of the history of Israel. Sometimes we read the books and we can kind of get sidetracked, after we read these different things, but there's lessons to be learned, and that's what I want us to take a look at tonight, is that there's a lesson to be learned here with leadership with these kings. And here in 2 Kings, we're given a look at both of the kingdoms, the north kingdom and the southern kingdom, and Pekah is there in the north, and Ahaz is there in the south. It's a divided land. But they, regretfully, unfortunately, they had something in common. Influence, or the lack thereof. Pekah up there, the king of Israel up north, we are told did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The Bible tells us that he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit. And so you might be wondering, well, then who is Jeroboam, and why is he continuing this sin of Jeroboam? Jeroboam was a son of Nebat, we're told there in the Bible. And if you look back into 1 Kings, you find out a little bit more about him. That Jeroboam was one of Solomon's officials who rebelled against King Solomon. And that Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, and he stayed there until Solomon's death. But after Solomon died, Jeroboam comes back, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, succeeded Solomon as king. And so Rehoboam, Solomon's son, comes into power. He becomes king, and he steps into a leadership position. Here we see with these kings, they have sons, and they are born into it. They receive this position. They receive this title of kingship. They don't work for it, but it falls upon them to become a leader. They're born into that position. And Rehoboam, when he becomes king, he steps in at a very difficult time. Quite frankly, he was inheriting a mess. We see that from time to time, don't we? Where previous leaders, they stop doing some things, and things begin eroding, and there's a mess, and they end up stepping down, and somebody else comes into that position, and they just inherit a mess. That's kind of what we see here with Rehoboam. He was inheriting a mess. We see that from time to time when a predecessor, depending on how well a job they do or don't do, can create a mess that the successor is left to deal with. And so Rehoboam, Solomon's son, when he becomes a leader, when he becomes king, essentially is given a ticking time bomb, a volatile situation. And if we look carefully, we can see that it all stems with influence. And that's what I want us to see here tonight. The influence. What are the influences on these kings? Now, the Bible tells us that King Solomon loved many foreign women. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 11. King Solomon loved many foreign women. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites that you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. But nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. If Solomon, it said, had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives, the Bible tells us, led him astray. You see the influence right there. And as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Can you see the role of influence there? Can you see the role of influence that it has on Solomon's leadership there in these few verses? Who and what we love can have an impact and influence on our leadership. Here in these verses, we see Solomon, instead of him leading, he becomes led. Oftentimes, the things that can influence us, we might not think has a lot of power and influence over us. But surely as time progresses, we begin finding ourselves slipping further and further away from the things that we used to do. Here Solomon is led not by the wisdom and instruction of God, but by so-called love. Solomon ignored the instruction and influence of God and began to look elsewhere. He began to look to foreign women, and those women influenced him. They influenced his behavior. They influenced the king's heart. And so you see here in these verses that it was the king's heart that would turn. And that word turn also can mean influenced. They had an influence over the king's heart. And so with the turning of the heart, we begin to see a turning of the nation. For different spheres of influence crept in. The king, who was in a position to lead, allowed other influence to lead him, and he was led astray. Instead of being a leader, he became more of a follower. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, and he began following other gods, the Bible tells us. Solomon began following other gods. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. And he began following Molech, the Bible tells us, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And so we see with Solomon's loss of devotion, it leads to divided interest. And this is what God had forewarned the Israelites about, to not be intermarried, because it would lead to loss of devotion and divided interest. And because of these divided interests, division would manifest itself in the land. And the land would begin to see these high places constructed, built up, places recognizing other gods. There would be other places of worship and sacrifice in the land, and the landscape began to change. It began mirroring the influences that had taken hold of the hearts of the leaders. And in many ways, the landscape around us mirrors the influence of the heart and the hearts of our leaders. What we see constructed, what we see built up. So Solomon allowed for the influence to settle in, and as he was led astray, he even began advancing these influences into society. He began construction and building of these high places and allowing these influences to creep in. And so the Bible tells us that the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned. His heart was influenced, turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And although he had forbidden Solomon, though the Lord had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. And so we see this division in the heart of Solomon, which would lead to the division of the land, the dividing of the kingdom. And this is what Rehoboam would inherit. This is what he would leave for his son, a kingdom full of division. A people who were looking for a leader to help and lighten the load. But Rehoboam would choose to do the opposite. He wouldn't lighten the load, he would make the load on the people heavier. He was making the tear on the fabric of the land worse. He didn't listen to the people when they came with their complaint. And the rift began to be more and more, and finally it was complete. The kingdom was torn. Rehoboam lost the people, and Jeroboam became king of the north of Israel and Rehoboam remained king in the south of Judah. And so under the new influence of a new king in Israel, Jeroboam, he constructed also 2 new places of worship. He established 2 new places of worship. No longer were people to be united at the center and go down to the heart of the land there in Jerusalem. The king didn't want that. He feared a rebellion if they were to go down there to the south to Jerusalem. And so the king, fearing rebellion, he instead brought more division and revision. He made 2 golden calves and placed them at the 2 worship centers there in the north. And he also sought to revise history by saying, "Here are your gods." He pointed Israel to those 2 golden calves and he said, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." You see, he is revising history here, and he was using his leadership, his influence, to create other centers of worship and revising history, telling Israel that here are your gods who brought you out of Israel. And the Bible tells us that this thing became a sin, that the people came to worship the golden calf there at Bethel, and they went as far as Dan to worship the other golden calf. And so tonight we have been looking at the influences of leaders and the importance of leadership. That leadership is defined, as John Maxwell said it, as influence. We have seen that it is of critical importance of what influences a leader has. We saw that Pekah there, if you look at the 2 Kings, there Pekah is influenced by ignorance. To him, the words of George Santayana hold true, that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. You see, Pekah did not look into the history of the other kings to avoid some of their mistakes. As leaders should constantly be looking at where others have tripped up, where others have messed up, and not to fall into the same pit. It's good to know history. We could say a good leader is familiar with and a student of history. That a good leader allows history to be a teacher that can implore us to learn the lessons from the past, to not make the same mistakes. When we look at Rehoboam there in the Bible, we can see that he did not listen to the advice of the elders or to the people's complaints, but he instead boasted in his position of power. We could say that a good leader listens, that a good leader relies on the wisdom of the experienced and does not threaten people with power based on position. And then we can look at Solomon there and learn also from his mistakes. We can see where Solomon lost his devotion, which led to division. Divided heart or divided devotion leads to a divided land. We can see that a good leader is established, that they form convictions and have firm convictions, and that they establish values. Leadership requires firm conviction and established values. You know, it's difficult to chart a straight course with a detouring heart. And so, dear friends, let us look at ways that we can continue to grow. We all have a potential to lead. But it's important for us to first learn how to follow. And isn't it great that the Lord leads us, that He calls us to follow, and that He sends us out? Let's continue to learn what leadership is so we can have a positive influence on our community, around the people all around us. Let us continue to learn. Amen. I hope this message has been a blessing to you. Until next time, bye-bye.